first issue is last year, we had a record tax package. The largest tax package in our history was tabled in the House of Parliament last year, in excess of $23 billion. I think it was closer to $24 billion
annualized.
On an annualized basis. And on Tuesday, we have another tax package of 15.9. We just use a round figure of $16 billion that was tabled on Tuesday, for a total of close to $40 billion. But the $11.3 billion to be raided from the National Housing Trust has to be added to that package. So there is now a record package of $50 billion between the two tax packages on an annualized basis and the $11.3 billion raided from the National Housing Trust. The total amount and the fiscal impact for this year is $50 billion. That is $50 billion, ladies and gentlemen, that the government is hoping to extract out of an economy that is in contraction. Even when we take out the NHT amount, and I'm going to come back to that later, you are seeking to take $40 billion out of an economy that is in deep recession, because recession is defined as having passed more than 2 quarters of decline in the economy. We are now 4 quarters in the entire calendar year of 2012. We have seen decline, and it is projected that this quarter we'll also have a decline. So the country is in recession, and it's against this background that the government has decided to impose this additional tax package. Now, but by way of context, in May of 2011, the then government of the Labour Party tabled in the House of Parliament a green paper on tax reform. That green paper on tax reform was inspired by a lot of work. It started with the Matalan report of 2004. It later went on where we had a study carried out by the Inter-American Development Bank. It then went on to the Partnership for Transformation. That is the labor unions and the private sector and everybody coming together to do work on tax policy. The opposition at the time, the PNP, refused to participate in those Partnership for Transformation discussions. The PSOJ working group also came and put in proposals. And all of that fed into the green paper. Now, what was significant about that green paper, ladies and gentlemen, is that the philosophical framework of the tax reform that was proposed, and which was supported by the Inter-American Development Bank and supported by the IMF, and put a footnote beside that, support by the IMF, because I have a question for the IMF in all of these discussions too. The philosophical framework of the tax reform was broaden compliance and lower your taxes. Lower consumption taxes, lower customs duties. Broaden the base to bring in more taxpayers into the net of paying taxes. That was the principle of it. And when you broaden the base by way of applying consumption taxes to a wider base and a wider number of people, we also had a program to put in place increases in the social safety net to protect the vulnerable in the society. That is the summary of what we placed before Parliament. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these tax measures that have been tabled between last year and this year, they reflect a wholesale abandonment of meaningful tax reform and neglects the work of so many individuals and institutions in fashioning a credible tax system that can spur growth and return us to a competitive economy. Tax reform has therefore been hijacked by a reckless and misguided thirst for collecting money, no matter the consequences that it will have on the economy. This tax package, while ignoring tax reform, has taken a negative trend, reversing important decisions that were made by the previous government, which were part of efforts to stimulate the economy. And they did work, because in the final year of our stewardship, despite the worst global economic crisis that we have ever seen, the economy of Jamaica grew by 1.3%. In that year, in 2011, it grew by marginally better than the United States of America growth. And we put some important things in there. We abolished the tax on dividends because it was a form of double taxation. And we sharply reduced transaction costs by way of transfer taxes and stamp duties. These were important elements in stimulating investment. In fact, we also abolished pretty much the stamp duty on the transfer of loans in order to increase loan portability and therefore inspire the financial institutions to more quickly and sharply adjust down interest rates. These were very important features of how we were able to begin the process of stimulating new investment. The fact is now that all of these initiatives that we put into place are now being summarily attacked by this government in the form of these tax packages, and this most recent one is a case in point. It is an wholesale attack, ladies and gentlemen, on the productive sector. A wholesale, unbridled attack on the productive sector. And I'm going to explain that now by simply speaking more directly to some of the tax measures that in fact have been imposed. But make no bones about it. This tax package that has been tabled on Tuesday is going to cause further contraction in the economy. It is inflationary, so it's going to lead to higher prices. It's going to lead to continued instability in the exchange rate. And the IMF program has no plan for us to be able to replace the foreign exchange that is going to continue to be drained from the net international reserves as a result of this sorry state of affairs. Now let's look briefly at some of the tax measures that have been proposed and what are some of the likely consequences of those tax measures that have been proposed. First of all, the tax on telephones represents, ladies and gentlemen, a tax on a tax. It represents a tax on a tax. Last year, the government imposed a 5-cent Jamaican and 7.5-cent US tax on local calls and foreign incoming calls, respectively. That was a tax per minute of conversation. What they have now decided to do is that they weren't satisfied with that, so they've decided now to put GCT on that. So it's a tax on top of a tax. And we are going to pay for it. Now, in terms of the GCT at the border, the border fees, that is one of that. Everything affects not just private consumer use, but also affects business. Don't forget that. Telephone also affects business. Now let's go to the border taxes, the port fees. First of all, the government has decided that they are taking all of the fees, whether it is customs user fee, soon to become the customs administration fee, the environmental levy, the common external tariff, everything will be bunched together and put as part of the GCT base. So in other words now, to keep it simple, GCT will now have to be paid on these fees. That's another tax on top of a tax. And in fact, it is questionable as to the legal status of that. We now have a team of attorneys that are looking at that for us to see whether in fact it is something that is legal that the government is doing. Putting these taxes, taxing tax. That's what they are doing. Then there's another aspect of this introduction of the Customs Administration fee. If you look at your tax measures report, you will see that they have now put in a raft of new charges that will be placed. This is on top of the additional costs that will come from GCT, which they are expecting to yield $1.5 billion. In addition, they have now listed a raft of additional fees, a new fee structure of things that will be charged at the wharf, totaling $1.2 billion. Mm-hmm. So they are now expecting to exact from the contracting economy and from a productive sector in trouble. They want a direct extraction of another $2.7 billion at the port. Let's look now at the stamp duty and transfer taxes. When I became finance minister, transfer taxes were 7.5% and stamp duty was 5%. We reduced stamp duty down to 3%, and we reduced transfer tax down to 4%. This reduction assisted greatly in improving transactions, speeding up transactions. In fact, we got reports from a lot of attorneys that people who could not deal with their estates, estates could not be probated because the transfer costs were just too high. As a result of this initiative, more probation of estates were able to take place because of the lower costs for transfer tax and stamp duty. What has the government now done? They have now decided to start the process of reversing that by increasing stamp duty to 4% and increasing transfer taxes to 5%, going in the wrong direction in an economy that needs a stimulation, in an economy that needs all of our properties to be freed up in terms of ownership, in terms of exchange, in terms of sale, and in terms of being part of a vibrant economy. This is going to drive a nail into that coffin. Then, in relation now to two matters which I'll deal with together. The question of corporate taxes and the question of the dividend tax. The government has taken on a give and take approach. You give with one hand and you take away with the other hand. Last year, they announced the reduction of corporate taxes from 33.33% to 25% for unregulated companies. Unregulated companies. That is companies that are not regulated by the Bank of Jamaica, the Financial Services Commission, and so on and so forth. And that they brought those down to 25%. That was the give last year. What is the take this year? The take this year is to announce on Tuesday that those unregulated companies that are now paying 25% corporate taxes, they must now pay 30% because they are imposing a 5% surtax or surcharge on that. So their rate now goes back up to 30%. That's the give and take. So what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that 5% they are taking back from those companies is money that could be used for reinvestment purposes, for expansion purposes, and for the purposes of creating jobs. Creating jobs that are much more sustainable than any broke-down Jeep could provide. Sustainable jobs. And that is a consequence right there. Then now there's the question of the dividend tax. We eliminated the tax on dividends. The Labour Party government eliminated it. We took it out completely because it was felt to be a form of double taxation. Why? Because the corporate entity is taxed, and at that time at 33.33%, and people who are then issued with dividends, you go and you take a tax. I think the tax at that time on dividends was like 20%. Mm-hmm. Either 20 or 25% was the tax on dividends. That was the situation. We abolished it completely. What did the government do? They imposed a 5% on dividends last year, and they have now decided to put the tax on dividends up to 15%. Here again, ladies and gentlemen, going in the wrong direction because it is hostile to investment. It is hostile to seeing money freed up for more redeployment into expansion and into growth. To me, it reveals the naked truth about the lack of understanding of this government, of how a market economy works. Very, very much so, because look at this 15%. Let me tell you a way it's going to affect us. It's going to affect everybody, including pensioners. Pensioners are now concerned about the JDX and the further impact it will have on their earnings. Well, this tax of 15% on dividends will affect pensioners as well. What do I mean? Pension funds are invested in the stock market. And the dividends earned on the stock market will now attract 15% taxes. So there goes the pension funds will now have to find that 15% to pay in taxes that is taken away from the proceeds of the pension funds that will be that is available for disbursement to pensioners. We must understand there's another negative consequence, ladies and gentlemen. This hostile act of reimposing dividend taxes is going to drive investors more and more away from Jamaican dollar investments. It's going to push them more and more back into United States dollar investments. And you know what that means? That means more and persistent pressure on the exchange rate. If you're heading back, flight to safety into US dollar investments. And that is not, if it's going to happen, it is, I guarantee you, going to happen. Let's turn briefly now to the question of property taxes. How collectible will these taxes be within the current scenario, except from the same people who have been loyal and faithful in paying their taxes? Let's understand what has happened here. We must clarify it first. Ladies and gentlemen, the government in announcing a 2% rate above $1 million in the unimproved value of property. That's where I'm going. That's the bottom line. Just go for the $1 million. Because the less than $1 million is nominal what they're charging. Okay? But $1 million in value and up. The government has announced a 2% rate. Now, what is significant about that, ladies and gentlemen, is that the rate is coming from a 0.75% rate. So you're jumping from 0.75% rate for unimproved values of $1 million above to 2%. What is that increase, ladies and gentlemen? Do your arithmetic. The increase is 167%. That is an increase in property taxes for the unimproved value above $1 million of 167% That is the effective increase that the government is expecting from property taxes. Now, a possible double whammy which the government must answer is that when I was departing from the Ministry of Finance, I know that there was a program to implement a new valuation. The question is, where is that valuation? Because the last time a valuation was done was 10 years ago, in 2003. And so if the government has done or is doing a valuation now, it will mean that a double whammy. You have a 167% increase on top of a higher value, unimproved value, based on a new valuation. And this is set against a background of a 35% compliance rate in property taxes, ladies and gentlemen. So, the question is, how collectible? Do you solve the problem by dealing with compliance, or do you solve the problem by simply upping the rate? The government has opted to up the rate. I don't know how collectible that is. I want to say, in relation to the education tax, that it is going to be a burden on businesses as well as on individuals who have to fork out more. Going to be a burden. But we have to serve notice to this government. Every red cent of that money must go to the Student Loan Bureau as promised by the Minister of Finance. It must not be promised and then arbitrarily removed and put into the consolidated fund. It must be dedicated to the Student Loan Bureau. I have to say before I wrap up a word on the National Housing Trust raid, because it is a raid. This is the most phenomenal, the most monumental raid of a trust fund in the history of this country. And let's understand the significance of it, ladies and gentlemen. The last time I looked at the balance sheet of the National Housing Trust, their total assets were in the region of $147 billion. Their liabilities were just about $57 billion or so, leaving their equity at about $90 billion. And that means that what the government plans to do is to, over a 4-year period, to literally take out 50%, a half of the equity of the National Housing Trust. And then to get up in Parliament and to suggest to us that this will have no negative impact on the National Housing Trust. Who does the minister think he is fooling? If you take out half of the equity of that institution over 4 years, on such an aggressive basis, I can tell you that the Housing Trust, the equity build-up on an annualized basis now is about $1 billion per year. So on one side, you're building equity by $1 billion per year, and on the other side, you're taking out $11 billion. I wonder if you understand, you're following the significance of what I'm talking about. Because where is the end game in all of this? The NHC is responsible for 60% of the housing solutions in Jamaica today. Despite that, there is a demand for 500,000, at least 500,000 housing units in Jamaica right now. That's the demand for housing. But instead of redirecting the resources of the National Housing Trust to deal with that demand and to continue to provide mortgage rates at an acceptably low level that people can take up their mortgages, the government has opted not to use the resources for that. They have opted instead to raid the National Housing Trust in order to support the budget. And I'm surprised that the International Monetary Fund, that they are supporting this kind of scandalous raid on a trust fund. And I have to ask the question. I have to ask the question whether the board has approved this. I have to ask the question whether it's a giveaway or it's a loan to the government of Jamaica. And if so, what are the terms? I have to ask the question whether the Attorney General of Jamaica has approved the scandalous deal. And I have to ask the question, how will it affect the ability of the National Housing Trust to fulfill the mandate and the purposes for which it was created? Ladies and gentlemen, let me end by saying to you that the most disappointing thing about the Prime Minister and the Minister's presentation Monday night and the subsequent presentation by the Minister on Tuesday in Parliament with this tax package that has come without rhyme or reason. It doesn't come in a context of meaningful tax reform. It doesn't come in a context where you say, okay, we are doing this, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. You're raiding the housing trust, but there's a light at the end of a tunnel. You arbitrarily impose taxes that are militating against investment in a recessionary climate. And the alternative that we had left for this government was a blueprint. That blueprint was lower your rates of taxes all around. It will automatically increase the levels of compliance. And for that matter, at the same time, sharply ramp up your revenue administration capabilities. That was the blueprint. And for those who are compromised in terms of food prices and so on, if GCT touches food prices, there was a plan there to mitigate that in terms of a social protection program. The blueprint was there. The blueprint to make the economy competitive was there. Because in a system like that, our manufacturers who are already, their backs are against the walls because they have high energy costs. And prior to our involvement, there was high cost for money, high security costs. All of these things militate against industry and enterprise in the country. But a taxation system now would be put in place that would reduce taxes and avoid the need for everybody coming to the Minister of Finance for a waiver. That was the context within which to abolish waivers. Mr. Phillips says he's abolishing waivers, but he's not telling us what the substitute for the abolition of waivers is. The white paper on tax reform is not worth the paper it is written on, because it is so watered down that all of the original principles of which that I talk about, of more equity, more participation in the taxation system, all of those have been thrown out the window. And I'm surprised that the International Monetary Fund, I am surprised, I'm going to repeat it, because the team is still here. And I'm told that the meeting between the leader and myself, which was scheduled for this afternoon with the IMF, has been cancelled. So since I can't tell them in that meeting, let me tell them in this press conference. I am surprised that the International Monetary Fund, that they are prepared to join with the government in this tax package that has no rhyme and reason except to attack the productive sector, that people that create jobs, and join with the government in raiding the National Housing Trust and not ensuring that we have a sustainable real tax reform going forward. I am surprised that the IMF appears to be supporting this. It is scandalous. And I'm telling them they better look at it again. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.